Thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Please like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week for Ask a Historian is Richard Collins, museum interpreter and past president of the Mississauga South Historical Society, and as we've mentioned before in this program, a fan of all things that run on rails. And for the theme of this week's program, we're going to be looking at a few historic railway accidents that have connections or at least proximity to historic Mississauga. And we have a few of them that we're going to wander down memory lane with here with Richard. But first and foremost, Richard, thank you for joining us once again here on Ask a Historian.
Oh, I was glad to be on. I enjoy it.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to kind of tie into your knowledge and your passion. And I think for the subject this week, we've got we may cover more topics, but we got four highlighted, four railway accidents highlighted, and we'll jump right in. We'll start with the chronologically here, and the first one is a very famous one, and it took place on March 12th of 1857. And it is the Desjardins Canal disaster, the Desjardins Canal and the approach to Hamilton on a railway line that ran through historic Mississauga and out towards the Hamilton area, the Great Western. And wondering if you can kind of walk us through that moment in time.
Yeah, it didn't. The accident didn't take place in Mississauga, but it was a train bound from Toronto to Hamilton, so it would have passed through Port Credit and Clarkson just minutes and maybe half an hour or so before the accident took place on the Great Western. And it's the second deadliest accident in Canadian history. There was one a little bit earlier on the Great Western, a railway that had a really bad reputation for train accidents nearly going. It was a company that didn't like to spend any extra money on safety. Very poor construction, as we'll find out in the Desjardins Canal. And some of it was technology. Keep in mind, we're going back to 1857. Trains don't have air brakes yet. They haven't been invented. You stop the train literally by just slowing it down when it goes to a stop and maybe applying some handbrakes, some wheels that can be turned, and no electronic signaling at the time. So trains weren't the safest thing around, and yet trains were the fastest things to work at the time. Trains that could go 30 miles an hour. This was just, an unimaginable speed at the time to imagine being able to travel faster than a horse could run, and yet, these things moved barreling down, made of iron, and yet very little in safety procedures. So one day, this train was crossing over a drawbridge over the Desjardins Canal, just a little canal that connects Burlington Bay with Dundas. The canal is kind of still there. If you go down to the Royal Botanical Gardens, they've incorporated the canal into their scenic area. And there was a drawbridge that was over. The drawbridge wasn't open; it was closed to allow the trains to pass. So that wasn't the problem. But the drawbridge wasn't closed tightly, and there was a bit of a jog between the two rails that they weren't quite lined up. And the front of the train skipped, and the train jackknifed and crashed down into the valley, into the canal. I don't remember how many people died. You have that information in the 50s. I don't remember how many people, sadly, that died in the train accident, but it was the worst of its time, and it was hard to get rescuers down into the valley to rescue them. It was an accident that just took place at a time when trains were just entirely unsafe, very little in the way of technology. It wasn't a faulty bridge, really, although there was a report a year later by Thomas Kiefer, a noted engineer in Canadian history, who made a lot of recommendations and a lot of safety protocols that became in force for the next 100 years, were all based on Kiefer's report, based on a lot of things that he found wrong with the Great Western and the way they were operating the trains. So good came out of it.
I just had a quick look there. The train had 90 passengers. There were 59 deaths and
59. Yeah, say 57, but 59. Yeah, so about 2/3 of them died in the accident, which is a pretty high fatality rate. And the cars, again, are made out of wood at the time, so they splinter. One of the worst things for train accidents, and we'll talk about one in a minute, that was telescoping, as it was, where you have a series of cars and one car pushes into the next car, which pushes into the next car. And they tell it like you're closing an old telescope that's in sections.
Wow.
They just ram into each other, and wood allowed that to happen, so you could crush dozens to hundreds of people. in train accidents this time. Now everything's all steel and reinforced ends. You couldn't have that happen nowadays. But yeah, another one of the problems with this bridge, the Desjardins Canal Accident. Notable amongst those was one of the people that died. It wasn't a special train, it was just a regular standard passenger train, but who happened to be on was someone by the name of Samuel Zimmerman, who was an earlier investor in the Great Western Railway, and then later in its competition, he got kicked off the Great Western Board and ended up going to a competing line, an American line that wanted to build a competing line between Niagara Falls and Detroit, which is the Great Western's main line. But yeah, he was in Toronto returning back to a business meeting in Niagara Falls, and he was one of the passengers that died in the Desjardins accident. He was one of the founders of the Great Western. He died in that accident.
So he's a founder of the Great Western. He left Great Western to work with another company, but died on a Great Western.
Yeah, what injustice, I guess you could say at the time.
A
bit of an unscrupulous man all the way around. He owned the land around Niagara Falls. So talk about prime property, and was notorious for kicking squatters off his land and then selling the land for industrial development and just flip on. He was a shady dealer. I mean, it's a tragic way to die, but I don't think a lot of people lamented his death.
So the accident itself, I mean, did it close the main line for a period of time, or was the bridge in good repair afterwards? What happened there?
I'm not sure. I'm sure it would have taken a few days to repair the bridge. And again, nowadays, if you had a train accident, there's so many railway lines all over the place that you can divert to other lines. Even if you see in train accident, you could still divert to CP. You'd have to pay them some rent in time, but you could keep your train moving. But back then, this was the only railway line around the Great Western. There was no competition. So when this railway line closed down, yeah, the whole railway system closed down because there was no other route for the trains to take. So it was something to get the bridge repaired as quickly as possible, despite the fact that that was half the problem in the first place, is that it was a poorly made wooden bridge.
Right.
So doing a slap-dab job repairing it could have only caused the same accident to happen again. It was a disaster. The Great Western had an earlier one near Chatham, which was just during construction, and they didn't ballast the railway properly. And that means when you build a railway line, you put a good subsurface and a lot of stone to anchor the right of way in place so the tracks don't shift. The investors were just cutting corners, saving money, thinking, we'll worry about it later. This was a place called Baptiste Creek. And there was a bit of a washout where Lake St. Clair kind of flooded over, it washed the tracks out, and then a train came barreling down. And that one, I think, was in the 80s. There's more dead in that accident. So yeah, the Great Western in its early days started out with a really notorious record. And so yeah, I wonder how many people living in Port Credit and Clarkson at the time decided to take a coach or to walk it into Hamilton or Toronto rather than get on the train. It could be a risky business at the time.
So from there, so that's the Desjardins Canal disaster of 1857. Another railway line and a different accident, although close to home, not in Mississauga, of course, but you can visit the site today, or at least drive past the site today of the accident. And this is the Great Horseshoe Curve wreck of September 3rd, 1907. And again, maybe beyond the Mississauga train derailment itself, in local terms, probably the best known, best remembered train accident.
Certainly in this area, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you can walk us through the Horseshoe Curve wreck.
We talked previous time about the Toronto Grey and Bruce, which eventually became part of CP. It was a line to Orangeville and eventually to Owen Sound. And so Caledon, it's pretty hilly. If you're driving into modern day Caledon, little villages like Caledon itself and Alton in the Credit Valley, it's pretty hilly. And as I mentioned before, trains, the best way for trains to get up hills is rather taking them dead straight up. You tend to curve around so you can go up at a shallower angle. And so they built something called the Horseshoe Curve east of Caledon, so that the train would take a fairly, like a horseshoe, would take a fairly sharp curve around a hill. The problem with curves is that, as I think I mentioned before too, when you're on a bike, vehicles have a tendency to turn into a curve. And if you got something heavy like the train, if you're going too fast, the way your tilt of your curve gets sharper and sharper. And so the faster you go, the more likely you could be to tip the train over on a sharp curve. Yeah. And that's what happened with this accident in 1907, I think.
Yeah.
And an engineer was just a little bit too much steam. He knew he was going too fast. The report later on said the engineer should have known better. He'd been traveling this route from TGV for a long time, but for whatever reason, he was either not paying attention to the throttle and let too much steam in, with the train going downhill a little bit. So this was going downhill. Again, if you're going uphill, your trains are going slow, just like if you're riding a bike.
Yeah.
Where you're going downhill, sometimes you have to apply the brakes so you don't go downhill too fast. I do that now that I'm getting older. I never used to. I go down hills on Lakeshore Road that I think 10 years ago I didn't put the brakes on. Now I'm getting a little bit more, I feel a little bit less balanced when I'm going downhill. And so he didn't apply the brakes. The train toppled over and all the cars derailed. Can't remember how many, again, I don't seem to remember how many passengers were killed. You think that's
114 injured and 7 killed.
7 killed. Yeah, I know it wasn't, 7's tragic, I'm wrong, but yeah, it wasn't like it was a great disaster, but he had 116 injured, which again, probably would have been more than half the train. Although I think it was busy that day because the train was going into some special event in Toronto. So they had a lot of young people. I don't know whether it was the exhibition or something that was going on, but it was some kind of event. So there were a lot of families on too, which is another reason why it hit the news because some of the dead were, people lost family members in this accident. And so, the engineer was blamed for the accident, unlike the Desjardins Canal, which was fortunately, Kiefer put the blame where it belonged. It belonged to the civil engineers, the ones that built the bridge. They were the ones, and the investors, they were the ones to blame for it. In this case, the engineer shouldn't have been going at the speed he was going. And the little locomotives jumped rails. And again, these wooden cars at the time, they didn't telescope, of course, because they all toppled over. But they tumbled down a bit of a hill because the curve was embanked on both sides. So, another unfortunate accident at the time.
I'm just reading this little blip here, but the passengers, there was about 600 people on the train itself, so 114 injured and 7 killed. The curve was supposed to be taken at 15 miles an hour, and it's estimated that they hit the curve at 35 miles an hour.
That's more than twice the speed. And again, everything's kind of a square when you're talking about centripetal force. So you're going twice the speed, you're actually going close to 4 times the centripetal force toppling you over. So he certainly would have known before the train tipped. I can't remember in the investigation whether he was unable to slow the train down, because once you get going downhill, again, you got air brakes at this point. Brakes are much better by 1907 than they were 60 years earlier in 1857. But
the engineer was arrested and charged and found guilty of negligence. So
he didn't apply the brakes when he should have, and deservedly so. If he was going 35 in an area where the curvature of the track, 15 miles an hour, he should have known better. And again, he was an experienced engineer, so he'd done this before.
They said he'd run the line many times.
So whether he lost track or something. I mean, this was a problem with engineers all from the steam era. It really wasn't until the diesel era when trains were electronic in the sense that diesel locomotives powered generators, and then it was actually motors. The point being is that when you have electronics that control the train, you can have something called a dead man switch, in which an engineer has to keep his foot on a dead man's pedal the whole time he's on the train. And if he lets go, let's say an engineer has a heart attack or something, and he's no longer control the train, his foot would leave a dead man switch that would activate the safety precautions, and it would bring a train to a stop. But in the days of steam, this didn't happen because everything was physical. A throttle, literally, you opened up a throttle to allow more steam into the boiler. And if there was no human to control that, the steam would keep going into the boiler, and the train would pick
One of the interesting things, if you remember, that we found, like, even though the rail line no longer traverses the Horseshoe Curve itself, that area has been rerouted. The Horseshoe Curve was adjacent to a road which carries its name, and that's known as Horseshoe Hill Road, up near Orangeville. And so that road and that location is still very much there, and it would have been a line that we know kind of connected to the different main lines around the Credit Valley in time, and others. And so it would have been a rail service that people from this community would have known and utilized at some point. So it's very much part of our local history, and it kind of has that legendary status in terms of rail accidents.
Yeah, I remember you and I think we got looking on Google Earth one day
Yep.
sometimes. And yeah, we tracked where it was. And you get the tracks are gone, of course, because it got ripped up during the Depression. It was one of the earlier lines to go. But again, the embankments are still there and there's
Yep.
farmland on both sides. But yeah, if you know where you're looking on Google Earth or Google Maps, you can still see the curvature. I'm trying to get my hand in the camera there.
Yeah.
To see what's so yeah, it's kind of, and it's a fairly sharp curve.
It is. Yeah.
And it's
So,
an S curve too, which can be even worse. An S curve is when you go from one curve and then you go into a curve going the opposite direction.
yeah.
And if you have a long enough train, you can have cars that are tilting one way at the back of the train and cars that are tilting the other way at the front of the train. And that can cause derailments. So railways, a lot of times, they had to build S curves when the lay of the land required it. When they got money, sometimes they would spend millions of dollars to completely level that land and go with a straighter track they had to.
Right.
Even today can be dangerous.
So from there we'll skip to one that is relatively unknown, although it happened right here in our city, and this was on March 23rd of 1916, right at the Port Credit Station on the Great Western Line, and this was the Chicago Flyer wreck of 1916.
Yeah, the newspaper called it the Chicago Flyer. I think sometimes the newspapers give them the Chicago Flyer. The Grand Trunk wasn't one for naming its trains. In fact, I think the train was train 47. The trains were just numbered back then. But it was a fast train that's a freight train in this case. This was not a passenger train. The Chicago Flyer, as they called it, was carrying freight. But they can be pretty nasty accidents because the weight of the cars and the number of cars. I don't know how many cars were in this book, but it was I think it was moving at over 100 kilometers an hour, 60 miles an hour at the time. It was doing some pretty good speed when it was passing through Port Credit. And I don't remember the details of what happened or whether it just skipped the rails and careened off the rails at the Port Credit station.
The story that I've got on this one is the Chicago Flyer, as the newspaper referred to it, was coming along the main line. And at Port Credit, there was a pull-off with another train.
There's a siding. Okay,
siding.
Now, there was a siding, and there was another train parked on the siding. Passing sidings you had at this time. If two trains are going to meet each other on a schedule, one has to pull over to a siding to allow the other train to whip by in the other direction. That's right, and there was a siding in Port Credit.
And the train on the siding didn't actually, it was either too long or didn't pull completely off the main line. And the Chicago Flyer plowed into the back of the train that was still jutting out onto the main line.
That's it.
Yeah. There was casualties there. There were in the Chicago Flyer the engineer
Harry Overend. I remember he died.
Yes.
I think,
they said they found his body still clutching the brakes. But
that may be true, but that goes back to the old Casey Jones. When the famous train accident in the United States, where the story goes, his hand was still on the throttle. It may be true, but I think if you look at the photographs of the wreck, the cars were thrown around pretty good. And the locomotive was pretty badly smashed up. So whether he was still able to hold on to the throttle, I don't know. But again, the newspapers could be a little bit colorful sometimes with their stories of train accidents at the time. I remember his name, Harry Overend, because there is a street in Toronto that was named after him, a street that he lived on. And you can still see it's fairly close to the downtown area. It's a little side street close to the old Grand Trunk tracks. And it's Overend Avenue, I believe, or Overend Street, I don't remember. So they named that in honor of him. So I guess he wasn't found to be a blame. Well, he wouldn't have been if there was a train on the, although there was signaling, the signaling should have shown that. The blame for that ultimately would have gone to someone called a dispatcher, which would have been at Mimico Yard at the time, who would have had to have known that the train that was told to take siding was too long to take the siding. And that, naturally it was going to, the back end was still going to stick out onto the main line. If there was blame there, it wouldn't have been the engineer, it wouldn't have been Overend's fault. And I think William Anderson was the fireman. With him, I think he died too.
There are two casualties. It's a miracle that no one at the Port Credit Station was hurt, or the infrastructure wasn't hurt, because we only have one picture of it, and it really shows a splintered mess of basically the faster moving, or the moving train plows into the back of a stop train, You know, and going at considerable speed. There's not a lot left of the Chicago train.
No, again, you got wood. Freight cars were still wood. Passenger cars were about steel by then.
Yeah.
Kind of mandated for safety, but yeah, freight cars were still mostly wood, and they would splinter into pieces.
Yeah.
Especially that train going 100 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, these cars are just going to be obliterated by. Yeah, so yeah, even just debris flying around could hit people on a State Bank Road, because it was closer to the State Bank end of the station, which is still a level crossing today. But yeah, I don't think anyone in Port Credit was injured.
No, it is one of those ones that's, you know, relatively kind of a forgotten one for some reason. It hasn't resonated down in the kind of the collective memory. Maybe it was because, again, it wasn't necessarily at a local connection in terms of loss of life, and I mean, there were two individuals killed, but neither one from Mississauga.
Yeah.
You know, it was an infrastructure challenge on the railway track, but didn't have kind of an impact on the community beyond. But from there, we go to one that is well remembered, at least in local term. And it is me, you know, I get, it's a tongue-in-cheek response sometimes when I say, "Do you remember the Mississauga train derailment?" And I'll respond sometimes with, "Which one?" Yeah. Of course, I mean, the major one is the Mississauga train derailment and evacuation of November 10th, 1979. But we won't talk about that today. That'll be a program unto itself. But the one prior to it, and one of the things that's interesting of it shares a date in terms of November 11th.
Yeah, that's true. I never thought of it 2 years earlier or no, hang on, 14 years earlier. 14 years earlier. But I never thought, to the day November 11th.
So November 11th, 1965, we have again a moving train that's heading westbound out of Toronto, plows into the back of a stop train at Port Credit. This also taking place on the Great Western Line in Mississauga. This accident took place right over the Hurontario Street overpass on the Great Western Line, just north of Lakeshore. Wondering if it is one of those things where it is well documented. I know we have a local resident, John Wilson, has some photographs of the accident, which we'll show, but wonder if you can walk us through, because it really, you know, until the 1979 train derailment, this was well remembered as this moment that
certainly in Port Credit.
Port Credit, yeah,
because it happened in front of a lot of people. I first heard about it from John.
Yeah,
because his dad was working at Thompson Lumber, and if you know Port Credit, Thompson Lumber was located right where the big GO station parking lot is now, immediately to the east of the GO station, and right along the railway tracks there was a siding, because Thompson Lumber used the railway to ship a lot of its lumber out, so that's why it was located there. And Thompson Lumber was a big employer, including John's dad. And he remembers the train accident happening while he was at work, and at lunchtime he ran home to grab his camera and come back and take pictures of the aftermath of the accident, where there was a one box car that was sitting on an angle. It had fallen off the bridge and down, sitting on Hurontario. The bridge had just been completed. There used to be a level crossing, but it was only about 2 years earlier, 1963, that the overhead bridge was put in, and Hurontario was directed under the tracks at this point. Otherwise, so yeah, he remembers taking pictures of it. Unfortunately, it was a slide camera, so the little pictures that John had were these tiny little slides that we managed to blow up, but they were kind of blurry. But then I think I wrote an article for the Heritage Mississauga newsletter, and when people read it, other people said, "Oh yeah, I got photos of that. My grandma or someone took photos of it," and then we started getting inundated with photographs that people had taken of it. So yeah, everyone in Port Credit knew about it at the time, because it was a big, loud accident. The particulars are pretty much the same as the Chicago Flyer story. There's one train at a siding and another train colliding into it. In this case, the train that was stopped was a Canadian Pacific train. Yeah. And this line is CN by this point, but Canadian Pacific had what was called trackage rights. They were able to move freights on this line, which they got from the old Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo railway. And so that train was on the line, and then it had to take siding because it was the tenant and the owner, as is typical, the owner, CN, got to let its train going eastbound, going the other way. So it passed, but the same thing, the one train side swiped the other. and it's the impact to just send only 3 or 4 cars toppled over, but it just happened to be the ones that toppled over were right at the Ontario Bridge. So this one boxcar comes crashing down, and the story I found when I looked it up in the newspaper afterwards is that there was a Port Credit woman driving to work in Cookesville. Lorette McDonald was her name. I don't know if anyone knows her. This took place in the 60s. She may still be around. But yeah, she was driving her car, and she just got under the bridge just as the boxcar came crashing down behind her.
Oh,
so
wow.
she was fine, but yeah, just close to, just narrowly missing Lorette McDonald just before she would have been, if she'd been a couple seconds later. Yeah, this boxcar, 100-ton boxcar, would have come crashing down on her.
Well, that had to be a scary moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and the one photograph we do have, I think, it's this boxcar. So it's kind of ominous. Again, yeah, it was something that it kept the line closed for a couple of days.
Yeah.
GO train service had just started a few months before that. Not that it was as busy as it was now, but that's forced commuters back into the cars for a few days.
And the bridge that this accident happened on is the bridge that's still there today. This is
still the one, yeah.
Still the one. So, next time you're traveling under here on Ontario Street or on here on Ontario Street,
Look up and
envision this rail car hanging off the side, and unfortunately, accidents have and do happen, and this is moving industrial equipment. No train.
And 2 died in this accident too. So yeah, again, it was the 2 crew, well, because freight trains, so no passengers.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the 2 CP crewmen died because it was their train that hit CN. The other way around. The CN crew died because of the CP train.
So one of the things that they really do highlight the fact that trains are behemoth vehicles that move at a speed and they do not stop on a dime. And in some cases you probably have knowledge on behalf of the train crews that an accident is going to happen, but there's not a lot they can do about it when they're in the midst of this moving behemoth of a vehicle. So it's it is maybe somewhat surprising there aren't more.
Yeah, there's a few other smaller ones that don't make it, but yeah, usually one I can just think of offhand is on the CP line near Dixie, and it was a freight train that was just loading explosives on from the Hands Fireworks.
Okay.
The Hands Fireworks was a big fireworks factory in Dixie, and they shipped their goods. And yeah, there was a train that had just loaded that on when it was crossing the tracks, and it hit a concrete truck, and the concrete truck was obliterated. That's just how big trains are when like a cement mixer kind of a truck. Those things are huge on their own right. But yeah, this train, and none of the explosives went off because the fireworks really don't explode. They have to have some kind of a fuse to set them off.
Yeah.
So it's not usually that much of a problem. But yeah, just this freight train just obliterated this cement mixer truck.
Well, this is an amazing kind of share to wander down memory lane with us here, and you're gonna look at the next time I don't know how many people have stopped as the train goes by and you count the cars, like the
they're getting bigger all the time.
Yeah, and we can look down the road at the major one. We know what we're talking about, the 1979 derailment, but there's certainly
the 79 derailment. The good thing is that could never happen again. It was the brief because we could talk about the Mississauga train derailment forever. But yeah, there were no hot box detectors at the time. What caused that accident was an overheated wheel. And you have this box at the end of each axle which lubricates the axles so they don't overheat. This one wasn't lubricating properly, so it's called a hot box. And now they have detectors, and there are 3 of them in Mississauga now, where there were none back in 1979. So the thought that another Mississauga train derailment could ever happen again is almost nil now because of the.
And I trust you've scouted the locations and know exactly where all 3 of those are.
Yeah, there's one that's just up the street from me in Port Credit. It's literally a 5-minute walk away. There's one up in Malton, and there's one the one that's right next to the GO Lisgar station. So it's just in Mississauga now. If that one had been there in 1979 rather, that's the one that would have detected the hot box and would have told the train to stop before it ever got to Mavis Road.
Right.
So it's there now. So yeah, the thought of train, and again, now train accidents on the Lakeshore West line, the line through Port Credit and Clarkson, it's all passenger trains now, and they're all on schedule. So
Yeah.
You'd never get a collision between a freight train and a passenger train on this line anymore. Trains are safer now than they've ever been.
Well, that also sounds like we're welcoming a challenge. So we'll we'll cross our fingers and hope that continues in terms. But it is fascinating to look back at this early industrial era and realize that, you know, this advent of new technology and new transportation didn't come without challenges, and accidents were part of that. So Richard, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion of railways once again with us. And
thanks for inviting me.
yeah, absolutely. And for everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us with another episode of Ask a Historian. Stay tuned for future episodes here, and like, subscribe, and follow, and stay up to date with Heritage Mississauga on the different programs and news in our community. And again, thank you for joining us with Ask a Historian.